So today, as Negan pointed out, I'll be talking quite about language and technology. And hopefully you'll be able to see areas in which we could maybe collaborate or they might fit into research and practice in learning and teaching. So I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by language processing and language technology more general. More generally, it's a sort of a fuzzy concept in some ways. But then I'll move straight into talking about two particular projects that we have ongoing right now. So collecting data and some initial results. And hopefully they'll spark some ideas and ways that you could see future collaboration or implementation in practice, as I've said. One talking about subtitling, and the other talking about simplifying texts, using computers to simplify texts. So in a very broad definition, I'm drawing upon here from Steven Pinker, that language is really one of the fundamental topics within human sciences. And really, if we think about it, even in a digital world, we're using language more and more, not just in text, but in other different forms. Language, we could say, is quite instrumental then to education, not just at the younger years, but right across the lifespan, and in many areas of our professional lives and, of course, our personal lives. In a sense of research, then, we get a lot from language data. So the collection of language data, whether it's in terms of input, so what we expose our students to, slides, videos, audio, things like that. Also in terms of what's happening in that process, that language processing, and what we know about language within multimodal contexts and how we can optimize that type of performance as well. We can also analyze language data in terms of outputs, so things that students type into assignments, feedback in online learning management systems, and even speech data. All of these are quite interesting depending on where it is that you're situating yourself. Language, of course, is hugely individually variable. And this is something that in a research context is very hard to quantify and account for. Language proficiency, language usage changes so much across different areas of applications, even across cohorts and classrooms. We also see that language has a huge impact on educational outcomes. I won't go into too much depth here, but obviously if there are language and accessibility barriers, there are barriers to outcomes educationally and indeed in other parts of our lives. What's quite interesting also is that with this shift to digital learning, language has become quite multimodal. So I'm not just talking about text, but also audio and video, which is quite a complex audiovisual text in that sense. Language is also quite embedded into technology, whether we're texting, using analytical tools, using Moodle, learning management systems, and so on. So it is really a central aspect in many areas of educational technology and learning analytics. Digital learning then, I don't need to tell you that we've become very much digitized and globalized in our education systems. And this brings with us many different opportunities, but also many challenges. It's not just a case of moving to video and that works out better for everybody. There are particular challenges that come with that. And also in a way of optimizing the language performance of the students who are using these platforms, materials, and so on. So we've moved very much from this kind of traditional old-fashioned approach to a very much more multimodal, complex environment situation. And obviously we're talking about blended learning and fully online courses, but also supplementary in materials within traditional classrooms as well. I was happy to see a very recent study looking at how ubiquitous video has become in education and how it sort of links into learning outcomes. Many of the authors from UniSA here. And essentially video, particularly as we move into the online and blended learning, has become really, really quite central. So we have the text, the audio, and the video, and these can present barriers in terms of language and also accessibility. So what can we do about that? There are also many different students who have very different language and accessibility needs. So not just a language proficiency issue in their first language, but we also have more and more students studying in a second language. More and more students who also might be studying even in a third language or might have different other support needs too. What's quite interesting is that the data that I'll show you and the literature that I'll show you show that we can not only cater towards all of these particular groups, but also students who don't need language supports stand to benefit from, for instance, subtitling or text simplification. So there's a huge potential here to enhance language processing for students in all of these areas. When I talk about language technology, I'm talking about the computational processing of human language for different processes and contexts. Some take a short amount of time to process, some are huge. Some of this data from MOOCs and these online courses can go in the hundreds and thousands, and some can be in a course or cohort of 50. You may have already come into contact with some language technologies in monolingual settings, so improving literacy using subtitles and captioning, so L1 or first language literacy. Information retrieval, so how we Google essentially is a language process, a language technology. Text simplification and summarization are used a little bit more in academic literature now. This idea of having a complex text and being able to identify the linguistic features that make it complicated and automating that, or at least measuring or automating that simplification process for different reasons. Academic texts principally are the area of interest here. Text mining, so looking at large linguistic databases, let's say a corpus of feedback data, and looking for particular patterns or features. Similarly, with sentiment analysis, used a lot in social media, seeing how people or students feel about a particular topic or particular intervention. And also more and more, we're seeing more automated interactions between a chatbot or an app and a student or an individual using it in their everyday life. And we want these systems to be able to use language in an intelligent way, to give feedback, to transcribe or make speech-to-text systems more automated, and to provide subtitles or captions. I talk here about same language subtitles, so presented in the same language as the dialogue. So right now you might see English subtitles appearing on the screen, so we call those same language subtitles or captions, as opposed to in more multilingual settings where we have machine translation and interlingual subtitles. So you would see the subtitle in another language at the bottom of the screen. What has changed quite recently is that there's a lot more access and availability through the internet for these tools, a lot more open source, a lot more open data available across different languages. We've also seen quite an explosion really in the type of content that's available to train these systems and to use them for different purposes. And also an increasing acknowledgement of the diversity of the students we teach. They've always been diverse, we just really haven't factored it in as much as we can and should going into the future. So you'll see a lot of these technologies being used in medical settings in different areas, but education is one that I think is particularly of interest here. So this first project, subtitling educational videos, makes use of a lot of these different types of technologies. So essentially we have, as I said, this growing prevalence of video in our courses in the various formats in which we teach. Also we have this, I guess, pedagogical change and institutional change towards online learning and flipped classrooms and putting more video out there. Students are using this in everyday life, for courses, for supplementary materials and so on, especially in the online and blended formats. But there are some accessibility issues in terms of students processing, this language processing, that information, this rich, contextual, complex information within a video. And some of the tools that we have available aren't really there yet. We haven't really optimized or thought about who it is that's interacting with this video. Subtitles, I argue, present quite an interesting solution here. They may be quite useful for students studying in a second language, with a language impairment, with limited literacy in one language, or indeed students who do not need any of these things. Students who may just turn them on also stand to benefit. So we see quite a lot of literature on subtitling, particularly in the area of language learning or language acquisition or second language acquisition. Here are just some of the big review studies. Van der Planck in 2013, looking at 3 decades of research focusing on comprehension and recall and some of the benefits students may have from using these subtitles. Essentially, it's this ability to cross-reference what's being said with what's written on the screen and being able to do that in a cognitively efficient way. Moving more into the academic space, then we see that subtitled lecture recordings, for instance, are better for vocabulary acquisition and particular linguistic features. We also see that there are gains in visual attention and the demands that we put on our students watching online videos, and on comprehension as well. And I like this summary from 2015 from journal Behavior Research Methods by Gernsbacher, concluding in a very, I guess, high-level way that subtitles benefit everyone who watches them, from younger children to older adults. So why weren't we doing this all along? And that is a good question, and it has a good answer. So a lot of this research comes from different areas of education, language learning, and so on. And a lot of the times it's quite, I guess, described as being empirically weak or having issues with a weak research design. They tend to be movies or TV shows, so they're hard to experimentally control. They tend to be pseudo-experimental conditions, so it's a case study approach or asking students how they felt about it. So really, to get a more empirical basis, we have a lot of work to do in terms of getting others to adopt these in an evidence-based and informed manner. As I said, we have this one-off study approach, or we've had at least in the past, and this reliance on offline measures, so a questionnaire at the end of the class or at the end of the week, rather than actually looking at online performance. But thankfully, with some technology, principally eye tracking, we can look at these things in real time now. What's also quite interesting then is that we haven't really in this area engaged with the literature on instructional design, particularly that of cognitive load theory, where a lot of these design principles have existed for some time, and they contain a lot of evidence around how best to present this extra layer of information, particularly to students who might find it overwhelming or not very helpful, because there are students who will be in that category. And of course, there are these typical adoption issues around new technologies as well, visibility, an empirical basis, and just getting our hands on the tools, training, and awareness, and so on. What's also quite interesting from a university perspective is that up until now, the generation of I'm saying human-generated as opposed to contrast them with machine-generated, but up until now, the reliance was on human-generation subtitling, which is very, very time-consuming. So if you're creating an online course like a MOOC where you've got a set of videos that you're going to reuse again and again, it's worth investing in that to have the quality level there. But if you're just subtitling your everyday lectures on a campus where you have tens of thousands of students, you're not going to have an army of subtitlers next door subtitling as you go through. So to really scale it and deliver it in any meaningful way, it needs to be somewhat automated. And I'll show you some examples here where the quality of it is pretty good. It still needs to be improved. There still needs to be a human in the loop checking the quality of it. But it's showing some real promise. Some of the other literature that I mentioned in language learning tells us that not only do we improve our comprehension and recall of the content that we just were exposed to, but we may even be able to acquire specific features like a lexical item, like a term, a concept, or a complex structure. And some experiments now in the lab look at acquiring particular linguistic features like the passive voice or particular arguments in terms of developing critical thinking or vocabulary and so on. What we already know is that subtitles, when we get used to them, are processed in a cognitively efficient way. So once we get used to them, they don't seem to be burdensome. Much like the automated reading process, if we all remember back to reading a word with our finger and maybe going to the next word and the next word, we don't do that anymore. It gets quite automated. Similarly with subtitles. We also are drawn to movement on the screen. So when something pops up, it's competing for our visual attention, and that automated reading process begins. So we have to make sure that they're meaningful and contain relevant content that's appropriate to that student at that level. Otherwise, we're just distracting them from the lecture or the PowerPoint that's going on the screen. Here's just an example of Google Voice to Text. So in this case, they're talking about a flipped classroom, not an afflict classroom. And we could see that that term particularly might be very problematic. So even though it does a good job, it needs cleaning up, it needs checking. We know then from this area of cognitive load theory that there are some particular features and effects. They're called design principles and effects that are particularly important here. First of all, this idea of the modality effect, of presenting the same information in two different modes, enhances our performance on a particular task, comprehension, recall, and so on. This idea of dual coding the same information across these two complementary challenges. We also have a split attention effect that is also something to consider, that presenting too much on the screen also competes for the limited resources we have. And in order to avoid that, we have to present information in what's called a spatial and temporally integrated fashion. Subtitles are like that by design, spatially quite compact and temporally within the same time as I'm speaking. If we had subtitles at the bottom of the screen right now and they were delayed by 5 seconds, it would be utterly confusing and frustrating. It wouldn't make any sense. But if we have small bits of chunks as I speak, it can be quite effective. We also then know that for some people, subtitles present redundant information. They can hear perfectly well, and they may not need to see all of the words that I'm saying as I say them. But when there maybe is noise or an accent or a particular new term or concept, you can see, we see with eye movement quite a lot, a jump to that particular lexical item, that particular term. So redundant information really interferes with what's going on. So we have to make sure that we don't just turn these subtitles on for everybody and it causes poorer outcomes for those who don't need them. This is very highly dependent, as I said, on the individual and the particular context. We use, for these experiments, eye tracking, this little bar at the top for kind of classroom-based research that you just pop onto the bottom of the screen, and EEG, electroencephalography, looking at particular parts of the brain that look at engagement and cognitive load. Some more recent research that we've looked at can identify this pattern. So we know a lot of this from reading static text. A lot of reading research comes from that paradigm, and looking how it applies to subtitling. So we have at the top this linear reading pattern, and these red dots are these fixations when our eyes stop on a particular point of interest or a particular word of interest. The larger the circle, the longer we dwell on that particular item. And obviously that could be for many different reasons. We might be bored, it might be a new word. So we have to make sure that the contextualization of eye movements or brain activity is meaningful within that context and the design of that experiment. We might have, for instance, a difficulty with a new word. Maybe eye tracking is a new word or elicits an effective response. Or we might have a regression or a regressive eye movement rereading that whole sentence or clause. And a lot of these are quite standard. So you'll see across a corpus of eye movement data, the same thing coming up again and again. We do the same thing. You also have shifts of attention, and this happens quite a lot in subtitling, where we'll start reading some of the text and we'll go to something else on the screen because it's interesting or flashing or drawing our attention away from that. Most recently, we've started looking at how we can use eye tracking and EEG to measure cognitive load in students watching educational video. So it became quite interesting to this idea of, well, we can add subtitles and measure how that affects performance and outcomes and things like that. But when you actually go to the literature of educational video, that hasn't been well established already. So we had to do some groundwork. So we find that eye tracking and EEG, as well as these offline measures, correlate quite well. So these self-reports and post-task measures correlate quite well with these online measures, which is good news. We also find that there are particular different forms or modes of subtitling that can produce different responses. And I'll talk to that a little bit later. But essentially, we can manipulate cognitive load depending on the design of what it is we're presenting to the student. We also know from more recent research that for students who don't need the subtitles, having them on the screen doesn't result in any lower levels of, we've looked at psychological immersion via a range of psychometrics, enjoyment, and satisfaction. And in fact, and this is for educational video as well as entertainment in these studies, and in fact, the scores are much higher on these measures for English second language speakers in this particular cohort. So not only do they help a particular group, but the group that don't really need them also don't seem to mind having them there. In contrast to some of my friends, when I say, let's go watch a movie, and someone will say, oh, it's got subtitles. I'm busy, don't really want to do that. We get used to it, we get over that. So the aims of this project are to determine the sustained efficacy of subtitles to enhance, in a broadly speaking way, language performance, so comprehension, recall within a particular context or course, and engagement for students studying in English as a first language. So I'm based in Sydney, that's the access to the sample that I've got. Students studying in English as a second language, and students with different levels of language proficiency and also working memory, because that is a factor integrating all of this multimodal information. We also want to explore different forms of subtitling, so having these verbatim or word-for-word subtitles that you'll see on Google if you turn on their automated subtitling or automated captioning service, versus the reduced or condensed subtitling that we see in mainstream media, so they condense and make it easier, preserving the sense and the meaning, but reducing unnecessary words or phrases. Or just these keywords that are very important at that time, a particular name of a model or an author that are particularly relevant, and seeing how these benefit people in different ways, if indeed they do. We also want to identify how this could be scaled if it does work. So how machine-generated subtitling might work in a real-life course, a real academic context, and benchmarking it against human quality or human-produced subtitles and checked or post-edited, so that's the human checking or editing of machine translation, and seeing which one of these works best. And then hopefully getting to the policy and practice aspect of seeing how people could actually use this in their own practice. So this is a study that is ongoing right now. So it's an online course in research methods that has 5 videos, and we're still collecting data, but I'll tell you some of the initial findings. Essentially, we're looking at 5 time points, so these fortnightly videos. It's not a heavy course, as you can see, but it's just to start out. And then 2 weeks after the final video, we do another test to see comprehension, recall, and so on. We expect a dip, but hopefully not as much as without the subtitles. We have some different experimental conditions and factors to take into account. So we're interested in comparing human-generated subtitles versus machine, and the human checking or the human revised or post-edited machine. Looking at the verbatim form of the subtitle, the word for word, the condensed, and the keyworded, and looking at different combinations of when students watch it in the same language versus watching it in another language, or indeed watching it in both languages. Some people prefer that, with respective controls and a sort of typical control treatment scenario. So as I said, we're looking at particular eye tracking measures, fixation count and the duration of those fixations, the number of regressive eye movements, visual attention on the screen, and blink rate, linking to cognitive load as well. Post-task measures and some self-reports, basically looking at comprehension, recall, acquisition of vocabulary, and engagement and satisfaction. So obviously we want also engagement to hopefully extend or get to the end of those really long video lectures that sometimes we have to get through. We take into account, unlike previous work, the proficiency. So if they're monolingual, their language proficiency in that language. If they're bilingual or multilingual, the proficiency in whichever languages they're using for the video. Looking at working memory through a reading and listening span, and then previous research has indicated that viewing preferences also has a consistent and significant effect on any of these models. So if you're used to subtitles, you don't have this acclimatization effect, and if you're not, we see that people are presented with these subtitles on the screen and our attention is just at the bottom and we really miss everything else. But we do get used to it over time. We use mixed effects modeling to look at all of these combinations and these factors all together. So some of the initial results from the first session show that the human-generated leads better quality, so the quality is top-notch, followed by the post-edited, followed by the machine-generated. No surprises there. It'll be interesting to see how it scales across the whole semester. Unsurprisingly, and as through previous studies, we see that the comprehension, recall, and acquisition of the vocabulary are higher, so these measures that we're using post-task. But also, and what's quite encouraging, is the engagement and satisfaction for the students is also higher in the verbatim, followed by the condensed and keyworded. So we're a little bit surprised there that the word for word is more preferred, rather than what we see mainstream, which is the condensed subtitles. As language proficiency and working memory capacity decreases, we benefit more from these subtitles. So we see, for instance, lower level of proficiency benefiting more from the verbatim subtitles, as in they need more help, whereas the higher level proficiency seem to prefer and benefit more from the keyworded subtitles. They need less help, but they want to remember those particular words or phrases. Similarly, we're starting to look at some of the eye tracking data, fewer and shorter fixations and regressive eye movements. This all correlates to the post tasks, and it's repeated from what we've seen in previous experiments, and higher blink rates. So we're blinking a lot more rather than slower blinks, meaning we're falling asleep, maybe falling asleep just before lunch. And some cars have this. If you have a Volvo, some of the newer ones have this blink rate monitor there that if you're getting sleepy at the wheel, it'll alert you. So quite consistent. So where's this going? So in the next couple of years, obviously this semester and into next semester, we want to collect the data for all of these time points and complete it. Move from the lab into a real-life study, particularly interested in what Joseph described earlier, looking at how we could test that in a larger scale, because we've still got a small-scale lab setting here, and also looking not just at higher education, but maybe K through 12 and high school and in other scenarios as well. So it might be very interesting to expand and explore that. We've also started to experiment with looking at video lectures already and entertainment videos and so on, and looking at eye movement data for how people naturally look at those movies and videos, and then overlay the subtitles later on into areas that basically take away less visual attention. So you might see if I'm pointing, the subtitle would appear underneath where I'm pointing to, and so on. So the idea of trying to integrate in a spatial and temporal way this extra layer of information on the screen. And that has proved also quite interesting. We recently started to test with an industry partner looking at captions in virtual reality. So you have your goggles on and you might see particular words or phrases in the room in the virtual environment to help the acquisition of new vocabulary. And also with augmented reality, even an app on your phone where you could show it over a particular, like a room like this, and people's names or objects' names might pop up. So there's an interesting exploration there of how that captioned information might be presented in this virtual or augmented reality of the future. Where's this all going? I would like to see this information being useful in more kind of semi or even fully adaptive systems where the user could turn on or off the different forms of subtitles depending on the particular needs. If we got to a point where eye tracking or EEG were much less sensitive in a way that they really are prone to a lot of noise. But if we could use it in a classroom setting, we could see a fully adaptive and automated system where it would detect comprehension issues and present subtitles or prompts to help you be more engaged or help you remember or recall particular information depending on what sort of data it's getting from whatever sensors we could possibly use. But that's the sort of blue sky thinking, $1 million funding kind of option, but so far we're in the first 1 to 5 years of just validating it, getting this empirical basis up and running and testing it in different areas. So on to the final project then, which is about text simplification, so simplifying texts using a computerized way. Text simplification is essentially trying to reduce the complexity, the linguistic or conceptual complexity of a text. And there are some issues with the overlap between subtitling and how this might be worth exploring that I'll talk about at the end. But essentially, this has been around for some time, so we can simplify text by reducing or curtailing lexical items, so words or particular phrases like shorter sentences, or using active rather than passive voice and so on, or limiting meanings, or what's called semantic compression. So essentially, these different types of rules have been used in monolingual and more recently in multilingual situations to make texts easier to understand for particular user groups. You might know of it as control language, style guides, or plain English, or plain language movements, and so on. But essentially, that's the idea, to make something a little bit more understandable, decreasing the ambiguity, improving the reading ease or the readability, improving the comprehensibility, so the understanding of the conceptual content within a text, improving the translation quality if it's translated by a machine translation system like Google Translate, And more recently, we've seen a lot of work showing that it reduces the cognitive load within students when they're reading particular materials. So within text simplification, we typically distinguish between rules or changes that we make depending on who's reading it or processing it. So human-orientated, obviously readers like students or people accessing websites and so on, or machine-oriented, making it easier to process for the machine, or a combination of both. Here are just some very simple examples of limiting the number of sentences or words in a sentence, not using the passive voice, having a maximum of 2 clauses per sentence, avoiding progressive forms like ing, like instead of I go rather than I'm going, and so on, using articles, basically making language explicit, less prone to ambiguity, and so on and so forth. We see this used quite a lot across the industry in different areas, automotive industry, tech industry, and so on, and quite well established. And essentially, the rules fall into these different categories: the word level, sentence level, larger and larger chunks of information, up to the document level, looking at spacing and formatting and things like that. What's quite interesting, though, is that when we did a meta-analysis of all of the different rules, only one rule, which was terminology, was common to all of them. So there's quite an inconsistency between all of the rule sets. There's also no real empirical evidence around which rules work and which do not work. We know that somebody using these rules in general, like a whole rule set of 200 rules, improves the comprehension and readability of a text versus a control. But we don't know which rules, or indeed which rule categories, give us the best, I guess, bang for the buck in terms of what's easy to implement and worthwhile. And again, we typically rely on offline measures. How easy did you think that was to understand? And these more predictive readability formula or indices, and that give you an idea, reference to the US grade system some time ago, about which level of education would be required to read and understand this text. What's quite interesting, though, in psycholinguistics and cognitive science and so on, there has been a lot of research in reading and comprehension and the types of errors that we recover from automatically, and the types of linguistic features are much more difficult to recover from, and so on and so forth. So there's this sort of lack of interface between the two. And of course, once again, limited applications, particularly in education and healthcare is one example I'll talk about briefly, because of all of these methodological issues. So the second project aims to look at collating all of the different rules that are available, seeing which rules work and which rules do not work, linking it to actual empirical data for people at different levels of language proficiency, working in their first or second language, and then testing it across languages using neural machine translation and across modes, and this is where the subtitling could possibly interact. An example here I'm going to present briefly is just from public health, but I think education is another idea. This is educating people about preventative things like vaccinations and so on, because one of the partners we had was the health service. I'll skip through that, but essentially we're looking for ways in which we can test all of these rules at the various levels using the same methodology again, looking at comprehension, recall, and likelihood of use, because the language barrier was a particularly important thing for the healthcare partner, and then looking at all of the different factors in language proficiency in one's first and second language as well. Later on, we want to, as I said, extend this across languages with neural machine translation and across modes, and develop a plugin. There's already an open source plugin that's available that you can use in Microsoft Word, and it highlights, much like the way the grammar and spell checker does, things that might be particularly difficult. The idea being that you would have empirical data for a low-level English language proficiency group, or medium English as a second language group, and you could automatically change the text based on that profile. And obviously then providing some training and outreach for those people using that. Once again, we see particular gains. This is a project, again, we just had our first data collection at the beginning of the semester. Comprehension and recall are boosted. We see some interesting effects across the audio and the multimodal modes as well that I'm not really sure that we can really report on yet in a meaningful way. And once again, we see as language proficiency and working memory decreases, people benefit more from these text simplification techniques. So the next stage will really be to complete what I've just mentioned there and identify the individual effects in different experimental conditions. And again, we see all of this happening with the eye movement data as well. So just finishing up, the same thing here, completing the data collection, applying it to different areas. I really see it working in education in terms of trying to explain or trying to automatically simplify text for different levels, particularly texts that are complex or conceptually difficult or linguistically heavy, and perhaps in the future integrated into other educational systems, particularly around feedback and so on, and allow these systems to deal with language in a more intelligent way. So just finishing up, these were two high-level examples, but just to indicate that language technologies may be interesting or may be of use to other research or practice in the area. A lot of it, as I said, is open source and easier to use than before, or more help is available. We're not just dealing with text, but the text, the linguistic or language processing of audio and video. And we're not just dealing with the input in terms of what students are exposed to, but also the process and the output as well. So all of these points represent really interesting linguistic features that we could study. So for instance, we've got this database of feedback that we're using through Moodle and Turnitin, and looking for particular psycholinguistic markers for like affective response or frustration, some problem-solving techniques, interactions between students, and also where a particular concept is complex. And obviously we can correlate or triangulate the language data with user activity data and other forms of learning analytics as well. And we also have a pilot looking at transcribing this workshop, looking at brainstorming and looking for these aha moments to see are there particular linguistic features. So in that case, we can automate all of the audio from the classroom and have it in a transcript and search through that in a much more efficient way. And using it in other areas of learning analytics as well, I think would be quite useful. So happy to discuss how that might actually materialize. So that's it. So thank you, or computer code for thank you. All of the references and some further reading is available through that link. But thanks for your attention right before lunch.
So we have time for one or two questions.
This was a fascinating talk, and I think I teach online and on Coursera, and really interested in putting some of this into practice.
Great.
One of the challenges I face is that my PowerPoints aren't just a bunch of static slides. Mm-hmm. So I teach programming. I'm talking through as I'm writing computer code. So interestingly, I have a kind of different transcript, right? It's not the words I'm saying, but it's kind of the semantically similar. Mm-hmm. Do you think if I added transcripts to this, that this would cause too much split attention and reduce comprehension, or that there would be like, am I already winning with the audio and visual dual channel processing, or would I be splitting visual processing further and actually have a reduction? Mm-hmm.
Great question. I think the issue here is that we're obviously testing it in a very experimentally clean way, and in reality most of our PowerPoints, and mine included, are quite messy. They have a lot of information. The transcripts don't really bode well. It looks at comprehension, and all of these measures dip quite significantly. A lot of students report that they don't use them. They find them as a distraction. They're not spatially or temporally integrated, so they're somewhere else or at the bottom of the screen. So anything that stops our attention going away from that code you have in that particular slide really detracts from it. So having the video, the audio already there is a benefit. What would be ideal is to look for a template or see how students are actually processing that information on your slide and putting those captions or subtitles in a way that reduces that, that visual attention being taken elsewhere. But the transcripts so far don't look like a good option. I know it's pretty common practice to have that. Students that we see in the lab typically say that they'd rather just rewatch the video again rather than going to the transcript, or they just read the transcript and then watch the video. So this idea of spatial and temporal integration is really damaged. But what will be interesting, and this is the way we generalize from some of those movement behaviors within the text of the subtitle, is also to look at predicting, and you can do this quite easily with modeling, where they go from the text to your piece of the slide that has code, or where they go after that, and basically trying to optimize it for that particular setting. So I think, yeah, a lot of potential there, but transcript's not so good so far.
We've got a question from online. A question regarding assignment feedback. Can machine learning apply to thesis marking? If so, what app do you suggest?
There's another machine learning expert in the room who might be able to tell you a little bit more about that. So I've just started using machine learning for learning some of the design features of the subtitling, teaching the machine translation systems to where to segment it based on human data. I'm not really in the area of looking at assignment feedback and marking. I think I'm aware of some research being done on that, but I'm not in a position to tell you about particular apps. Maybe somebody else is. I'm outsourcing or crowdsourcing a response.
Thanks. There's another question on what's the best subtitle app according to your experience?
So the one we're using now is, well, I think best is, I guess, the one that will come out of this. I'm sort of trying to upsell later on. But the most prevalent is certainly Google's speech-to-text. It's pretty good. It has, depending on the environment, with noise or not, 90+%, even up to 98% accuracy, which is really quite impressive. In a small MOOC where, as I said, you're reusing the same video content, I think it's useful to invest in checking that. And transcription services are quite cheap. A lot of students also working in this area might be using it for their practical experience and so on. But if it's perishable content, like lecture content for 1,000 lectures every week, really the approach that YouTube has and others have is probably the most likely option for that. It's the most scalable.
Perishable content, I like that.
Semi-perishable.
I'd like to just echo that because we've put in a great deal of effort into subtitling many of our videos now, and and we're just using the Google algorithm in YouTube, and it gives you 95% plus.
It's pretty good.
It's incredible.
And you can also see that in a particular environment, so in this environment now, we might have noise, it might drop, but if you sort of train the speaker and have a nice quiet environment, you can really optimize what you get, go over and check the job that it's done.
Yeah, we found audio quality is the key. Key part in getting the thing. So there's another question. Have you tried, sorry if I missed the first part of the talk, have you tried translating already available transcripts to different languages and experiment with them as subtitles with the students?
Yes, yeah, we've done that a lot with with one Coursera course in economics to look at the effect of the bilingual subtitling, and it seems to work pretty well. There are issues in translation as well as things that work within, in this case, English, but there are also issues that can go wrong after the machine translation stage. And again, the post-edited version, the machine output checked by a human seems to be the best.
Thanks. We
got one final question here.
Do you make your subtitles, are they closed captions? Can students opt out of them? Can they opt into them? Or are they persistent on the screen and they don't get to escape?
Very much the former. So for the experimental work that we've been doing, we've tested all of these of what happens when you can't turn them off. In a real-world situation, you have to let them turn it off. I think it could be really distracting. It could really lead to visual attention being competed for. See that in the move to digital media in general, the user always has that choice to turn it on or off. It's different than what we had in analog, where the subtitles may have been what's called hard-coded to the video track, which some people might like. But essentially, in moving into this environment where it's personalized, student-centered, the student has to be able to have that option. They may turn it on and off at different points. Some even speed up the video to try and get through it faster and turn on the subtitles, which is quite interesting. But yeah, I would very much, and from what we see, that it is dependent on the student in that context.